Wheel of Genre, the podcast for listeners who are haunted by a past they just can't escape. Right now, we are reading Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions anthology. This episode, we're doing Miriam Allen deFord's The Malley System. We are making our way through the entire anthology story by story, but we also have a podcast where we read different genres of, genre fiction, do a couple a month, and post that on Spotify, Apple, YouTube. So if you like what we do here, check it out there. I'm Zach, and I'm really interested in the motivations of the author. Why was this story written?
Why would you do this to your readers? I'm Bob. This week, I'm interested still in the new wave. What is going on here? Why does this represent the new wave? What a crazy story. Last week, we read a crazy story. I was too rude about the story. I kind of regret that. But I feel like this is also another shocking. It's violent. It's extreme violence. It's uncomfortable violence. I don't really want to read a science fiction story like this. What a wacky story.
Wacky is a hell of a word. Just to rewind a bit, as I was editing last week's episode, I was like, man, we are really being downers on this story. And then some of the comments we got were actually people who who seemed to think that we really enjoyed it, or who were super super enthusiastic about it. So maybe our emotions didn't adequately come through, our distaste for the story. But yeah, reading this one, I was like, oh, it's another one of these.
Yeah, another shocker. Okay, so what do we have here? It's another one of these. It's another violent one. It's Miriam deFord in the introduction, and I think this is quite interesting too. In the introduction, all Harlan Ellison seems to be able to say is how old she is. He says it in every paragraph. My, is she old? She is so old, but yet she can write so well. He's only focusing on that, and I feel like he's running out of things to say. And I'm kind of having doubts about what the new wave will be. It feels like his little steam engine, or whatever he called it earlier, I think he calls it a rocket or an engine, this new wave, I feel like it's running out of steam.
Yeah, well, so this story right here, I think, breaks most of the preconceptions I had about what Harlan Ellison is trying to do with this anthology. And we'll start with the age thing, just because he brought it up. But as I understand it,
again and again.
deFord was born in the 1880s. This is a 19th century woman who's writing this story. And I mean, it's one thing to have like Isaac Asimov, introduce it, or all these other guys who are really like golden age sci-fi guys, but I think that the inclusion of this story in particular really breaks this idea that we're looking into like the next generation of SF. I don't know. I don't know if we can really stick to that thesis anymore.
Let's look at the story. Let's look at the plot. I feel like the point behind the story is quite new wave, as far as what we've read from Philip K. Dick and writers like that, where it is here's a law. Here's a new law that could happen in the future, and what are the consequences of that law? What does the new society look like? And I feel like that is very much what deFord is doing here. In the Malley system, Malley is a psychologist and has decided, I guess a penal psychologist, has decided that a new system for criminals is to be forced to relive their crime again and again and again. So they find that it's effective many years later, because at first the criminal just enjoys reliving the crime. They loved it the first time, now they're going to love it even more. Eventually they start to feel disgust, and then by the end, the character in the story asks the other psychologist that has taken over, because Malley was brutally murdered, but asks this new psychologist, is there any recidivism? Do the criminals ever come back? Do they do crimes again after they're released? And they say, no, of course not. But they're forever locked away in a mental asylum because their brains have been fried from all of this torture, from all of this reliving their terrible crimes. So in that way, I feel like it's very new wave. But I'm not sure if old Harlan has his hands on his project anymore. Do you feel like this is a new wave story? What the focus?
Well, I would compare it actually to a new wave story that we've both read and can both kind of kind of hold up as I think a pretty peak example of new wave, which is Harlan Ellison's "I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream." People are trapped inside of this, computer simulation, and they're being kept alive by this artificial intelligence, and they're being tortured, yada yada yada. But this, like, the nuts and bolts of this story is really not that different than the vision presented in that story. To the point of where I would even wonder, what kind of inspiration or cross-pollination happened between these two.
Did Ellison just rip this off?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And this is post-Clockwork Orange, I did learn today. So I think there's a lot of these ideas floating around. And I think that, it is new wave in the sense that it is, it's philosophic. It's talking about penal justice. It's talking about, recidivism. It's how do you fix prisoners? What causes crime? How do you get people in and out and back into society? There's things going on in here. There's ideas. So yeah, to answer your question, I think I have more to say, but just to answer your question, I do think that this is new wave.
Okay. So we're kind of coming back to, I guess, what Harlan Ellison is going with this. One of my favorite book podcasts is Liminal Spaces, and he did this episode, and he was also reading Dangerous Visions, and he said at this story, he stopped. He said, I'm going to take a break. I feel like it's making me sick. And he looked into the further stories just to see what he was getting into. And he found some of the authors talking about their stories that they wrote later. And what he concludes, the guy from Liminal Spaces concludes, is lots of these stories are shock value. And what Harlan Ellison was doing was trying to shock people, because Philip K. Dick also writes a story for this. But later, he says, that story I wrote for Dangerous Visions, I really regret it now. I wish I hadn't written that. And it feels like these authors are being pushed to shock.
Yeah.
Do you think that is important when defining a new literary genre? Or do you think it's kind of, it's obviously over the top, but do you think it's over the top for no reason?
Well, I mean, it's tough. I'll take you through my thought process, because I read the story the first time and I was mad because, we start off with these 5 vignettes. And what these are the memories of each of these, criminals.
Criminals.
Yeah. Just pretty gruesome descriptions of 5 different horrible crimes. And I just felt kind of like, what are we doing? Because I think that the way that they're presented, which is very matter of fact and without remorse and kind of relishing a bit in the details, I think a little too much. It strikes me as vaguely pornographic, murder, blood, pornographic. I found it completely distasteful. And I think I kind of zoned out for the second half of this very, very short story. But I just basically said, I'll come back to this and read it later. But I was really disappointed, I think, because I had high hopes for this anthology. And I think that between the last story and this one, what I'm seeing is the editorial vision, which is edgy. I think edgy is the only word that you can really tag on something like this. But my question for you now is, having said all of that about the first 5 vignettes, I do think that the second half does redeem it in a way, by framing those vignettes in a certain way. But would this story still work for you without those vignettes? Do you need them?
Do I need these? I think they're deeply troubling, and I don't think they necessarily... I get that people do terrible crimes. I don't want to read about them necessarily. I think it might be a more interesting story if it's more, well, I know this is always what everyone says for science fiction, if there's more world building, but if we can really see what the society looks like, because it is just horrible, and then info dumping. And that does not feel like a very well constructed story. If it were, this is what people, and good people and bad people, are experiencing in this new law system. This is how it impacts all of culture, how it impacts many different people. I think that would be more interesting if it were a little bit longer and maybe we had one or two of the grisly details and not, like you said, kind of relishing. It is kind of pornographic. It is indulgent for very dark things. I don't think that was necessarily, it wasn't necessary. It just wasn't needed. But I got a kind of flip back question for you, because the thing I was most interested in is that deFord, and I think you're interested in this too, was a Fordian. And that means that she followed Charles Hoy Fort. This, I guess you could say he is the guy who brings scientific inquiry to the paranormal. And that means he goes out and he finds tons of data that is contradictory or could contradict different scientific theories. So he amasses paranormal reports, and he just puts them together to say, look, you thought science figured everything out? Well, it doesn't. It's the original. It's kind of like Ancient Aliens, I guess. Just putting stuff together
X-Files.
and throwing it at you.
I think he's like
X-Files.
Proto Fox Mulder, really.
Scary Mulder. Scary Fort.
Yeah.
But I think it shows, well, so no, it does not, I don't know at all if it does, but it just really reminded me the way that she tells this story when it is vignette, 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 because Charles Hoy Fort, the way he published at least the Book of the Damned, was just, like we said, tons of stories, tons of eyewitness accounts, or tons of folk legends, tons of things that show what we believed was true might not be true. And he just throws it at you so you can kind of he gives you conclusions, but it reminds me of her throwing these terrible crimes, giving you a conclusion, but you have to front end with the proof, I guess, with the data.
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't think we can actually make that comparison. It just made me think of that.
No,
it's interesting
I think that's a really apt observation, because I went in with the Wikipedia article, knowing that she was a Fortean, knowing that she spent her time to travel to California to investigate and interview people who had seen a poltergeist. You know what I mean? Like knowing that she is of this stripe, and then going into the story expecting some of these kind of paranormal elements to maybe influence her writing, and finding absolutely none, and walking away feeling a little like, I don't want to say disappointed, but just kind of like, my expectations were upended. My expectations were a nicely set table. She just flipped it with what she gave us. But I do think that stylistically, that is a really good observation. I think that it also helps that she's also a crime fiction writer. And not only that, but like a historical crime fiction writer. And I think that right there really does a lot of the work to explain why she relishes in these details in a way that reads totally distasteful to me. But I think that's her MO. And I haven't read her other books, but I have to imagine if they're crime fiction, if they're mystery, it's relishing in the gruesome details. But in a mystery novel and in a crime fiction novel, so much of that is answering the question why. Why did the killer do it? Often, I mean, that's what the whole mystery novel is leading up. Who is the killer and why did they do it? And this is another way of asking that question. But it doesn't ask it on an individual level. It asks, what do we do with the criminal now that they have done it? And these are the worst of the worst. They're people who will do it again, gleefully even. It's not crimes of passion. They're all, they're psychopathic crimes. So it's like, I think she's asking the same questions. She's just exploring it in a different genre, in a different mode, in a different style in this text.
I think you're right. I would really also like to see more of the attachment to the character or the detective. I think that's a big part. Not just figuring out why the evildoer did what they did, but how does the detective or the people who are trying to do good get through that? A big part of Mulder, you brought up X-Files, is his sister has been taken away. Yes, he believes in some crackpot theories, but he has to, because if he doesn't, his sister is dead and he's got nothing, his search is over. So he has to go and find her, and we attach ourselves to him because of that. And I feel like if we had a detective or someone invested in doing the right thing in the face of all of these bad things, that is an interesting aspect too. So even if there is all of the nitty gritty, we at least have someone who's trying to bear it instead of someone who is just gleefully reliving it.
I have a question for you, and actually, this is the first question I posed in this episode. But like, let's think about what the message is here, right? So, like, we're in a society. They have a technology that allows that forces criminals to relive their moment of criminality again and again every day for 12 years, and we think it's good, but then it turns out that what happens is that they all go insane. So they don't go back to prison. They just go to asylums. So with that being said, what is she warning against here? Why write this? Like, what do you see her messages being?
Why write this? I think if we look at the end when she's reflecting on what she wrote, I guess the afterword, when she says, she's asking us, the readers, what do you think is worse, the crime that they originally committed or the 10 years of having to relive that crime to drive them totally insane so they become totally broken? They're in the mental asylum, but they aren't now potentially more violent. It's not that has happened. It is almost that they are brain dead. They've been cooked and they're kind of not inoperable. They're not very functioning anymore. And I feel like that is an interesting question to ask. If we use some sort of punishment system, what are the results? What does that does it actually help rehabilitate the person, as we now speak of for penal systems? Does it help rehabilitate them so they can enter back into society? And this is the goal for this Malley system, but it doesn't work at all for rehabilitation. It feels like the conclusion might be the death penalty here. It's hard to say exactly what she's going for, but it seems like she might be suggesting the death penalty would be far nicer for these people. Or maybe she's just saying we need to be wary of how we choose our punishment systems. And science fiction is great in this case because, yes, we will be able to probably advance and make people experience things again and again and again. So why not start asking that question now? How cruel would that be, even if we think it's good? It could turn out like this, and are we willing to do that? I feel like it's a valid question to ask.
Yeah, totally. I do feel like it's complicated, though, by the fact that it ends with the person being like, oh, the last two wardens here had heart attacks. And then the guy being like, oh, a heart attack? He's like, well, the prisoners got loose and they attacked the wardens in the heart. It's a pun. So basically what we get is this idea that the prisoners escaped and sought out revenge from, or rather not from, but on the warden 2 times. And to me, that raises a whole new level of like tonality to this, because if the prisoners are escaping, it means that the punishment is a kind of torture, and it's something that they personally resent against the warden and want to lash out at the warden for doing. So it's not it's not rehabilitating them. They're not thankful for their time. They're not better people. You use the word cooked. They are cooked. And it seems like it's a very painful process of cooking to get them to that point after 12 years, to the point of where they lash out. So the tonal note that I find a little disharmonious is that I don't know what message to take from that other than that I'm supposed to feel empathy for these prisoners. And I don't know if that's a emotion I'm quite ready to feel, especially after the first 5 vignettes happening, 500 words earlier. Suddenly, in a small way, I'm rhetorically being asked to feel something for these prisoners. Like the fact that they lashed out, I take it is as being evidence for their for needing a more humane punishment for them. I don't know. What do you make of this? Did you get that tonality, or what's going on?
Yes, I think that's what deFord's going for, but there is the difference between the prisoners still under treatment, still being rehabilitated or punished, and then the people who are then released and are totally cooked where they don't react at all. They are then moved to a new place, a mental institution where they are non-persons. But they're also non-persons because of how violent they are to begin with. So it is a hard thing to feel any empathy for them because they really don't deserve any empathy. So I think we are supposed to think, okay, if we have this new system, is it too cruel or not? Should we just use the death penalty, or should we not punish people? Or should we not find creative ways of punishing people? It's hard. I don't want to have to be made to feel like the bad guy reading this and think, I would like these people to suffer because they deserve to suffer. And then at the end to be asked, but don't you think that they've suffered too much?
And maybe that's like what we can take away from this story, right? Is like, it's asking us to confront our own feelings of wanting revenge, or of wanting vengeance, or a vengeance, or justice. But I don't know. It just feels out of control for me. It feels out of control of what it's trying to communicate, in the sense that I don't walk away with a clear idea of what is being communicated. I'm getting a scenario, and I'm getting revulsion, sure, but I'm not getting a crystallized vision of what the author wants here.
That might be okay for science fiction. It is just a big question. And it makes me think of hell. I know there's not really any Christian undertones, or at least there's not intentionally in this story. But often you think about hell and you're like, okay, well, how long does someone deserve to be punished? If hell is eternal, shouldn't people eventually be able to get enough punishment and then be able to leave? Or do you have to be condemned forever? And obviously, we're human beings, so we want to have people rehabilitated. But if they've done something so cruel, when's the cutoff date? You know?
Yeah.
If someone's that evil, what do we do? It is a fair question. It's very hard to answer. But obviously, it's not rehabilitation. It is punishment for punishment's sake. And how much can we take? Yeah. As the onlookers.
And I think I actually like that you pulled the Christian string, because it does almost play within the tropes of like Dante's Inferno. This idea of having these kind of like highly ironic punishments in hell that you suffer for all eternity for the things that you did up in life. And, for a criminal, it's totally in line with that to have to revisit the crimes that you've done. For someone like the cannibal, it says at first the cannibal relished it. They enjoyed every day continuing to eat and eat and eat the person. But then after a while, they got sick of it. They got sick of the taste. It just reminds me of like Dante. There's a room in hell where the gluttons go, basically, and then they just have to eat something. Actually, The Simpsons parodied this in a really great way, where Homer went to hell, and Satan said, "You have to eat donuts every day," and he just kept, "Oh." Like, we've never seen anything like this.
He's defeated hell.
Yeah.
Homer, the original Orpheus, the second Orpheus.
Yeah. I'm not sure how far I can really stretch out that comparison to Dante, but I liked you bringing in that, because I think that there is that element within, punishment in general. Actually, back when I was living in Philadelphia, I went to the Eastern State Penitentiary to go check it out, and this is the penitentiary system that Foucault wrote about, the Panopticon, about this place. And another one like it in Pennsylvania. But the idea behind these prisons is to imitate the monastery. So you put people in these rooms and you give them a bland diet and a bunch of silence and a Bible. And the idea is that they're supposed to enact the monastery lifestyle until they repent. And that's kind of like the underlying core of the what became the prison.
We should probably wrap it up, but I do have one. I'm still so interested in this story, even though we said maybe it's not the best story. It does bring up lots of interesting questions. And thinking of the death penalty, often I think, well, okay, there are people who do certain crimes, and I don't want them to be forgiven. I don't want all of the energy to go into rehabilitating them. But America especially is, even though we say it's not, it really is a Christian nation, So the culture is to forgive, obviously. And you think of Hercules. Hercules is someone who wakes up and he's killed his whole family. And now the rest of his story is going to redeem himself, and we eventually forgive him and say, wow, you're a great hero. But even though he's tricked by the gods, he's cursed by the gods to kill his family, he's still a family murderer.
He worked off that karmic debt with all those labors.
Off that pretty quick through a few labors. I guess they were impressive, but he is half a god. Still, the ancient Greek idea of a hero is to be very tragic, to do something terrible, and then to work your way out of it, and to be pitied, or to be not even pitied, I guess just to have gone through something tragic that makes you a hero. But we have a child rapist and murderer. That's the first vignette. I just erase that person. I don't care if you get rehabilitated. So I feel like that story, if that's the first vignette I'm confronted with in this story, I feel very negative about the whole project. I do not empathize with that person. And even though we are supposed to be asked, are we a forgiving nation? Are we, even in the future, even if we don't say America's a Christian nation, are we going to be a Christian nation that forgives in the future? And are we going to avoid cruelty? Yes, we should probably avoid cruelty. But I guess, obviously, this is failed rehabilitation, and we should be using rehabilitation. But it also asks us, who deserves to be rehabilitated? Are there certain crimes that are too far? And should you remain in hell forever? Or should you get out eventually?
Cool. Well, we won't stop reading this anthology, despite, when I started this...
punish ourselves?
This story, I was just like, God. How many of these? But I think... Yeah, let's keep it going. Every story we read in Dangerous Visions challenges my idea of what Dangerous Vision is. Maybe that's ultimately a good sign. Maybe. I don't know. But let's just see where it leads us, especially as we get into authors that we're more familiar with, like Philip K. Dick. So, yeah, lots to look forward to. Many more short stories. Talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Zach.